Well, you will know that my name is Volker, and this is a bit the story of my life. I've been very lucky in many occasions. I was born in Germany, in Hamburg, in 1930, and that was before Hitler came to power, but the situation in Germany was already difficult, unstable. The casualties in World War I were tremendously high. I mean, I remember reading or hearing that at the beginning of World War I, the British soldiers rode into the battle on their horses, and there were the German with machine guns. I mean, it was just slaughter. I mean, they then learned quickly, but it just shows the mind, the preparation, how World War I was like a bombshell on the world, particularly Britain, because Britain had been at peace since Napoleon, which was about 1812 or something, and World War I started in 1914, so about 100 years. So it was, and the casualties in World War I were very high, I think for all countries, because of the machine guns were new. This was so the world was Europe was unstable during those years, and there was a Great Depression also in the United States at the end of the 1920s. My parents met each other at high school in the 1910s during World War I, and then got married and stayed together. Then in the 1920s, I have two older siblings, an older brother and an older sister, and then a younger sister was born in 1936. Well, then of course Hitler came to power in 1933, and everything then changed. It didn't directly affect me. I was a child. I was born in 1930, so but it meant that I did leave, and the whole family left in 1939, 1938, 1939, because it was getting dangerous. I mean, the Nazis were very strong on involving the youth, and as a teenager it was very important to take part in those things, so that my elder brother and sister went to a boarding school in Holland, that it was run by Quakers from United States and England, United Kingdom, after World War I, to try and bring at least the young people together after World War I. And then so my elder brother and sister were sent there because it was getting dangerous for secondary school. It was important to take part in these Hitler Youth activities. And there's a story about my elder brother coming home and saying, "Oh, the teacher told us that so and so were rotters," and so on. Well, one of them was my grandfather on mother's side, and no, on father's side, and another one was I met through them, and they were very nice fellows. Should I tell the teacher that she was misinformed? Well, that would have been politically a huge mistake, and would have had all sorts of repercussions. diagonally opposite us, we had the local Nazi who sort of kept an eye on our district. Every month you had to have you didn't have to, but everybody did. It was expected, and the party saying to have a meal cooked in one pot, and that was its name, Eintopfgericht. And the money that you save, the party member would come around and collect for the party, not for the government, not for the state. And this was part of life. And so this gave them an opportunity once a month to be on your doorstep and check, I mean, just chat and so on. See how you were received, and children and so on. So that was the degree of surveillance that one had. So after this story about my elder brother asking this question, should I tell the teacher? He and my elder sister, who was also at secondary school, were sent off to this Quaker boarding school in Holland. It was fairly near the German border, as it happened, that part of Holland, not over in Amsterdam. And they were very happy there. It was a very nice school. In fact, my parents had been at a rather special school. German secondary education was very militaristic still in World War I and even beyond. But they met at this much more liberal school. It was a private liberal school. My father's father was one of the school committee running the school. It was relatively small. And some of those teachers from that school, they lost their jobs when the Nazis came in, but then they were then teaching at this school in Holland, this Quaker school. So, there were these connections. So I was also sent there, but that's a slightly different story. A lot of people, of course, were emigrating. And some countries like England and the United States had already closed their doors, said, we've taken enough Jewish refugees. I mean, our family are not Jewish, but the political atmosphere was very different. As I say, one of my grandfathers was a minister in the government after World War I for a while. Yes, in fact, he was lucky that he was out of Germany with his wife on holiday in Italy, and somebody who was in the know sent him an urgent letter and said, don't come back, you're on the list to be arrested as soon as you do, because he'd been a politician against the Nazis. And so he and his wife lived in Switzerland for the rest of their lives, and I remember visiting them there. But anyway, so my parents thought about they should leave Germany too, like a lot of other people were. Even, I mean, we were not Jewish, but just political, the situation was untenable. But by that time, countries had closed their doors, but New Zealand was still interested in building up its population. It was 1.5 million only, and so they got visas for going to New Zealand. But they'd never. He was a lawyer by profession, but he'd had, because of this, my other grandfather was in charge, built up this series of pottery factories. They were just small factories that he'd bought up that had sort of never got back onto their feet after World War I. I mean, just think of the difference in tastes between what we would call Victorian taste and after World War I, well, Picasso and all that. And so a lot of these small factories, there's a lovely, a good band of clay runs from Sweden through an island in the north, in the sea there, and then through Germany, running southwards a bit west of Berlin, and then somewhere down to the Lake Geneva. And along this band of clay, good clay, were villages and little towns that each had their little pottery business. And it was grandfather on my mother's side that towards the end of World War One and just after World War One, these didn't make it back onto their feet commercially, and he bought them up very cheaply, and he built up a little empire that way. And my father was often the troubleshooter for him when, I mean, these were just little factories all over the place. And so father had been interested in science. His brother went into science, and he went into law, but it was up and touch and go whether he would follow science or law. As it happened, it was law that he decided on, but he was still interested in science. And so the idea was to go to New Zealand, but would there be a job for him? I mean, he was a lawyer, and a lawyer is not a job you can move from one country to another, because the laws are different, and you have to, and of course the clique of lawyers, I mean, they're very tightly controlled, and you'd have to start again at the beginning of studying law in that country. Well, who would pay for that? So the question was whether he could go to New Zealand and find, through his general business experience and something to do with the pottery industry, whether there would be a job for him. So they set off in 1939, and this meant that I went to this boarding school in Holland also. Of course, I was aged 8.5, and this was a secondary school. But there were other families who were in a somewhat similar situation. Particularly Jewish emigres, and so the school had a baby class as well. I'm not sure at what age it actually started, but then it had a baby class that I know, and I was the youngest in the baby class. But I could do arithmetic. I was always good at that, and so I was able to be with them and move up into the mainstream of the school in September 1939. So we all had visas for New Zealand, and then there was also my younger sister who was aged 3, and she was also in Holland with a governess to look after her, so that we were all out of Germany. They didn't expect there to be a war to start, obviously, but you never knew. And then it happened that father, as I was saying, was he was the legal and financial director of the ceramics company on my grandfather, my mother's grandfather's side, who had died in early 1930. And then another uncle died in that family. Well, when an uncle died, he was one of the directors of this ceramics company, and then there had to be some changes, of course, and in particular, one of the brothers was rather sharp, and the widow of the uncle who died needed to be protected, and so on. So father travelled back to Germany in the summer of 1939. It was possible to fly at that time already, not very easily. You went on a plane in the morning and then flew and landed on a harbour, so these were seaplanes, and then you stayed in a hotel, and the next morning you took off for the next one. So that was how he got back to Germany, and he was just going to be there for 2 weeks to tidy up the legal aspects of the company and the change in the directors and so on. During those 2 weeks the war started. and so he was stuck there until 1947. Was when he, yes, it was 1947 when he then finally got to New Zealand. He couldn't come. The Allies didn't let people out immediately that the war was finished, because then all the Nazis would have disappeared. Some of them, of course, had already got out through Spain, and Spain was a friend of the Nazis. That was how it evaded being overrun militarily. What was I going to say? Yes. So father was just back for 2 weeks and was stuck in Germany then. Well, then there were us 4 children in Holland, including younger sister, aged 3. And but we had visas to go to New Zealand, and then at the end of October we left, to England, and then to New Zealand by ship, of course. And interesting, the ship kept zigzagging. This was to avoid, try and avoid torpedoes, because the submarine has to expect where will the ship be exactly, so many minutes from now, and then line itself on that spot, and so on. And that's why the ships sort of zigzagged along, etc. This was part of crossing the ocean in wartime. Anyway, we got to Australia, and then from Australia to New Zealand. But my mother was there in a hotel room, and had to get a cleaning job. She, of course, wanted my younger sister, who was 3 years old, nearly 4, I suppose, to stay with her, because, I mean, the other 3 older ones, me and my older brother and sister, we got sort of not adopted, but cared for by 3 different families. But a 3 or 4-year-old, it would have to be an adoption, and that would be the end of, as far as my mother was concerned. And she just didn't want that. And so she only sought jobs where she could have young Viola with her living in. Those jobs were not easy, especially during the war then, and being an enemy alien and so on. I mean, he's had having her living in with the child had sort of, well, it made people ask questions politically and so on. But then she was lucky, and a farmer, his wife left him, and they had children, 3 children of similar age to my sister Viola, and so she had a job there as housekeeper for this farmer and their family, and I was very welcome there during my school holidays, and so on. I was cared for by a family in a different city, Wanganui, and they had 4 children of their own, and they just added me to their 4 children, and I had a very good time there. I could discuss a bit the life that I had there. I mean, the heating of the water in the house was purely by wood. Well, the climate was okay, warmish. I mean, it was a bit cold in winter, but the hot water daily, and so it needed a lot of chopping of wood for the hot water system, and that was my job. And we had 1 cow, and so then at the end of the milking, Dad, that was Mr. Veach, or Jock, who was an elder son, they did the milking of the cow, but I did the separating of the milk from the cream, which is a centrifugal force thing, and the cleaning it up afterwards, as well as chopping all the wood for the heating and some of the cooking. So I was busy, and I was physically very active. And Zizi remarks how strong I am still in my shoulders and my arms, and that still remains from that as a teenager. Yes, so that was my life, and I was very happy with them. And I went to a good school. Dad, as I called him, as the other children did, was a teacher at a secondary boarding school, teaching bookkeeping and economics, which was important for, I mean, it was a school, it was 80% boarding school, modelled on Eton and these posh schools in England, but in New Zealand it wasn't exactly posh. It pretended to be and tried to be, but it wasn't in reality. But they were mostly children from doctors and yes, professional people with boarders. 80% of them were boarders, and then there were some from Wanganui itself, like me. Yes, I was very happy there, and did well. Yes, and at the end of my secondary school there, I won a scholarship. There were public exams. I won a scholarship to go to the university, which didn't pay everything, but it was one of the better quality ones. But then, as well as that, I worked during the school holiday, during university holidays in the summers, and earned extra money that way. So I was financially independent of the Beach family, who looked after me all during the war, just as there was one of their sons. They had two sons. They also came, also at the school, same school, and. Yes, and then I was independent then. I had to be. And as I say, we were washing dishes at the student hostel the first year that I was there, and things like that. Then during the long vacations in the summer, working on a farm or on some other job. One was on a building job. And that's how I then grew up, and then I won other scholarships after to carry me forward. So I did a master's degree in maths in 1 year because, well, this was because of the New Zealand situation. That it wasn't, I mean, here people come up to do a maths degree and they already know a lot of maths. In New Zealand you didn't have that. And so I could do that in 1 year. Not the only person. And then I did 2 years for physics, master's degree, including an experimental thesis. I won enough scholarships to carry me through those. And then at the end of that time, I won a scholarship to come to England. That was a bit better paid than any of the others. I mean, people were not conscious of inflation, at least not inflation-proofing things the way they are now. But this was a scholarship from the Shell Company, the international Shell Company, and they, of course, understood about inflation. And so it was a higher level. New Zealand is sort of divided into 4 sections, 2 in the North and 2 in the South Island, and these the heads of the Shell in those 4 areas, they'd come together every now and including for selecting the person for the Shell scholarship. I think it was one of their sort of goodies to come together, a nice thing to do, meet these young people and have a lunch together and so on. The personnel manager in Wellington, at the top one, didn't expect me to be a serious candidate, but I don't know why. But he was interested in the testimonial that my maths professor had written, and I don't know. My maths professor was quite a character, but in a very good way, in a very sensible way. He'd been he'd come from England at the end of the war. He'd been a city councillor in Leeds. You know, that was in the bomb flight path to Liverpool. As a city councillor, he was very much involved in. I mean, he wasn't called up. He stayed in was one of the northern cities. I can't remember which one. So being a very responsible person. So he was very good. But anyway, the personnel manager of Shell in Wellington thought, I wonder how the person, when we meet him, squares up with what the professor wrote about him. And so instead of being off the list, God damn it, the others, they all voted for me for the scholarship. So I was lucky. And that then brought me the next year to Cambridge. And here was another lucky thing. Neville Mott was professor in Bristol. And out in New Zealand, I knew somebody had come back from England and said, Mott is the right person for you to work with because of your interests. And so I was applying to Bristol. But then they, in London, the Shell people, picked up on their antennae that Mott would be moving to Cambridge. And so they switched my application to Cambridge and probably had to pull one of, you know the English expression, pull strings, yes, so as to get me also into a college. And so in fact I arrived in Cambridge, and that was in 1948, October, the same time as Mott arrived from Bristol. And this is now the story that you like. What I hadn't realised was that Mott didn't have a circle of graduate students around him. He wasn't a person to build a group in that way. But he was very good at talking with experimentalists, and he'd done this during the war, and seeing things that needed doing where theoretical physics or somebody like with that kind of background could be helpful. So he said, well, I'm going to be rather busy and with this new job, and wouldn't you like to do with ionosphere or fluid dynamics or something? And I spent a day and I thought, no, I don't. I mean, what attracted me was well, metals, solids were down to earth, and as a New Zealander, you know, that was practical, not ionosphere. Who cares about the ionosphere in New Zealand? It's you know, a population of 1.5 million and a country that's stretched over 1,000 miles. And you only had 1.5 million people. You had to be down to earth, as we use the expression. And so the quantum. But this was the first time, really, after World War II, that quantum mechanical calculations could be done. Well, in the 1930s there had been calculations on individual atoms, hydrogen, helium, lithium and so on. They'd got as far as aluminium by the time I came in 1947. 48, 47, 48, 40, what was it, 47 or 48, I said. I came in 48, I think. And well, I got lost, but anyway, yes, because this was a real quantum mechanical calculation, one of the early ones that directly related to the experimental work that was going on at that time. And so it was on the one hand the future, quantum mechanical, On the other hand, it was down to earth. It was doing some calculations relating to measurements that they were doing at that time in Cambridge. So this was ideal for my conception. So I was very lucky. And so Mott said, well, why don't you go down to the low temperature group and see if you can make yourself useful? And lucky me, I found something that I could do. The first project that I looked at were heavy metals. And the quantum mechanics of heavy metals I couldn't do at that time. But light metals like aluminium with orthogonalized plane waves were possible. And Mott was extremely helpful in keeping me in touch with solid state theory that was going on in the United States. There was practically none except some magnetism in this country, and there was nothing on the continent. This was just after the war. It took time to recover and start building up. So I worked in some ways as an offshoot from the United States, because Mott received from every quarter. John Slater, as part of his contract with his research contract, wrote up in a volume each quarter, I think, or each half year, what was going on in the field of electronic structure of solids for everybody. Mott was one of the people who received these. So from that, I knew what was going on about orthogonalized plane waves and so on. So I was lucky in that. All these lucky things together. Yeah, and in 2 years, instead of 3 years for a PhD, I finished in 2 years. And off I went to the United States. Mott arranged for me to work with Charlie Cattell in Berkeley. Charlie Cattell himself was not in good health, and he was in Hawaii for his health. So I was there instead of him, relating to some of the experimentalists in Berkeley, and then also elsewhere around the United States. I went traveling around. I was encouraged to do that. So that got me into the swim of solid state theory. Then after 1 year, I had a position in Cambridge that I could go to, a university, not a teaching position, but a research position, but fellowship, that I could do what I liked. And so I went back to the Cavendish and started doing electronic structure things, continued doing electronic structure things, and gradually building up the group.
At what time will you become a member in Clare College? When you arrived, maybe you were in other
I wasn't.
college?
From New Zealand, I was rather suspicious of colleges, and I didn't try to become a member of a college or anything. But then in 1960, the person who had, Brian Pippard, who had been doing the physics teaching in Clare, became a professor or something, and was not. If you're above a certain level, you cannot get paid for college teaching. You're allowed to do it, but you have to do it free. So in practice, it doesn't happen. And so in 1960, Eric Ashby was just appointed as the new head of Clare, and everything changed. The previous master of Clare had been senior tutor and master for 50 years. So if you count back 50 years from the 1940s, that takes you to before World War I. And so you can imagine. I mean, he did a wonderful job through the Depression and through the war and so on, but there was a feeling amongst the existing fellows that it needed to move into the 20th century. And so I felt at home there straight away. And so I was appointed in 3 years in the first instance, but then it rapidly became clear that I was happy there. I mean, although my image of colleges from New Zealand was much more old-fashioned, and Clare was not like that. So, yes. And of course the 1960s were a time of upheaval. I mean, it was the government expected Cambridge. Well, after World War II, everybody realised that you needed an educated workforce, and so the number of positions for universities, the new universities at Brighton and Bath and so on, were all founded in the 1950s or 1960, and they were attracting a whole new range of students, and so there was a lot going on in these directions, including changes in Cambridge, and the number of fellows had to increase, and the government demanded that the number of students was increased, and so on. So there was a general atmosphere of change. And of course, then some people suggested, well, why keep single-sex colleges? Why not go co-ed? And King's College and Churchill College decided in the 1960s that they would go co-ed, and then it took a bit of time for the schools to be informed and so on, that people would apply. I mean, at that time, people made applications for going to Cambridge colleges for some years before, because their father had been there, etc. It was a very old-fashioned kind of family tradition. So a lot of adjustments, detailed adjustments had to be, psychological adjustments had to be made. And this came during the 1960s. And one of the questions was, well, why not go co-ed? Have women in the colleges. Instead of, you see, there was Girton College way miles out of town, and then there was Newnham. And that was all. Well, this discussion was going on in several colleges, not in others, but it wasn't clear. And then I remember the time came where it was clear that we should either go with the other two colleges, which was Churchill and King's, or not at all. I mean, or put it off for some years. And this was then 1970 that they were going. So in 68, Clare really had to get off the fence, as we say in English. And then we voted, and we agreed to go to, that we would go co-ed, but only by one vote. It required, to change the statutes of the college, required a 2/3 majority of the fellows. And 2/3 is quite a lot. And so we were right on that borderline. And so, but then we had to have a special meeting specifically, because according to the statutes, designed for changing of the statutes of the college. Well, then I was away and somebody else was away, and the 2/3 majority was away. So, but the feelings were very intense in a way that even surprised me. I remember writing that it's the only time in my life that I have seen grown-up men literally hysterical at this idea of going co-ed. I don't know whether when we finally did they still felt that way. I hope not. I don't think so. I mean, it all went so smoothly. And yes, then in 70, we had the girls come, yes. We had a 2/3 majority, and that worked in through. But only just by one vote.
Ah, I didn't know that part of the story. When I was first arrived in Clare, those fellows and also information leaflets
Yes.
describe the proud things in the history of Clare College. Become one of the 3 colleges first accepting female students was one of the
Yes.
proud things in Clare.
Which year did you come?
1991.
91. So that's quite a long time later.
Yes.
Yes, because this was 1970 that this changed. Yes. Well, that was interesting.